Since my last video on the subject was very well received, I've decided to make a bit of a follow-up video. Because in the previous one I mentioned that the Russian army seems to have made a series of erroneous assumptions before beginning their invasion of Ukraine. To be specific as well, when I say the Russian army here, I mean the Russian command staff and very possibly Putin himself. One of the most serious and wide-reaching of these errors appears to be the underestimation of the Ukrainian army. And this is a big underestimation too, not just in terms of fighting spirit, but in weaponry, equipment, and tactics as well. One of the best indications of this is the Ukrainians' continued successful use of the TB2 Turkish-made Tier 2 UAV. This thing should be dead meat by all accounts, and yet it appears to be wreaking havoc amongst Russian troops and, most importantly, the supply columns. I will explain precisely why this is so very weird a bit later, but first let's talk about the hypothetical error made by Russia. Firstly, why would Russia underestimate Ukraine? Because in hindsight, it seems an almost impossible mistake to make, considering the relative size and equipment of the forces involved. The Ukrainian army is by no stretch of the imagination small, as it has some 215,000 regular in-the-field military personnel, with another 53,000 local National Guard forces. This would put them at de facto parity with the Russian army currently invading. Ukraine is also expected to be able to call up and arm considerable reserves, perhaps as many as 250,000 men. And it's not like these are backwater savages with sticks and stones either. Most of their equipment is very similar, in fact, to what's used by Russia today, mostly because it is the equipment used by Russia today. Being a previous part of the Soviet Union, Ukraine has access to a lot of the same old but still in active use military hardware that Russia has. Indeed, the average Ukrainian infantryman's kit will be near indistinguishable from that of his Russian opposition. If anything, with all the Western arms support and training afforded to Ukraine after 2014, the Ukrainian infantry soldier is probably better armed, with far more and more effective anti-tank weaponry and man-pad equipment than the Russians are. We'll get back to equipment again a bit later, but let me finish my point here before I get too distracted. The reason why the Russian commanders would make this seemingly silly mistake is because of what happened in 2014, when the Ukrainian army seemingly refused to fight against Putin's little green men, and allowed themselves to be disarmed by what was very clearly an invading hostile force speaking Russian. Now, in Ukraine's defense, this was something particularly unheard of at the time. A nation very blatantly invading another neighboring nation, but refusing to admit it. It sounds so very idiotic, but Putin just simply shaking his head and saying, "Nuh-uh, I didn't do nothing." Well, it was enough to practically paralyze everyone. And by the time Ukraine or the West had gathered up enough resolve to finally call Putin's bluff, it was all over. Crimea was occupied and 2 pieces of the nation had been sliced off. And let's not mince words here, this was an absolute masterclass in political brinksmanship by Putin, where right underneath the noses and in full view of the international community, he annexed a peninsula in public, fully officially, and created 2 independent republics in just a couple of weeks, with minimum sanctions or responses from the powers that be. A success like that is liable to make just about anyone overconfident, and that seems to have been precisely what happened. In the speech where Putin announced the invasion in 2022, Putin urged the Ukrainian defenders to lay down their arms. And judging by the subsequent actions of the Russian army, it looks like they believed it would actually happen. I mentioned the airborne assault on the airports near Kiev last time, and I genuinely think this was a very bold and potentially brilliant move. If successful, it would have cut off Kiev from the west and any potential western support of arms and ammunition, even as armored columns were approaching from the east. It was a swift, decapitating strike that in theory was solid, but in practice was thwarted by determined resistance. But more so, it shows that Russia wanted a quick war. They wanted it so badly that they were willing to use Belarusian territory to get it. And this is significant because Belarus had been positioned as semi-neutral grounds, a very useful state where Putin could have control and deniability at the same time. But now that is all gone, a substantial sacrifice. Furthermore, we can also look at Russia's strategic level targeting priorities. They have, until just the other day or so, refrained from striking out at power plants, bridges, or civilian infrastructure like TV, power, and internet. Now, by the time I'm recording this, literally the same day and somewhat yesterday, they did start attacking these things. They started striking the television tower in Kiev, and they are trying, apparently, to enter into the nuclear power plants, probably with the intention of cutting off power to large portions of Ukraine. And to make it perfectly clear, too, Russia didn't do this because they couldn't destroy these things or seize them, or at the very least severely interrupt them, but because Putin probably wanted Ukraine as intact as possible, both for the obvious and immediate economic reasons, of course, but also, and probably even more importantly, so as to be perceived as the liberator. Yet again, a fundamentally flawed assumption right there, as the Ukrainian state, army, and people of 2022 are next to nothing like those in 2014. And the Ukrainian army has basically been in a state of limited war now for 8 years, on the borders of the independent republics created by Putin, Luhansk and Donetsk. They were clearly both willing and able to fight. But again, try telling that to the all-powerful statesman flying high in a cloud of euphoric success. Just like you can try telling him that his army may not be up to the task. In 2014, the invasion, quote-unquote, was conducted near exclusively by Special Operations Forces. Since they didn't wear any insignia, it's difficult to determine precisely what type of specialists they were, but later analysis of their weapons, tactics, and general equipment, as well as vehicles, has cobbled together a fairly good guess. And that guess would be that it was the 45th Guard Spetsnaz Brigade of the VDV. This is an elite formation of professional soldiers that can be expected to carry out their missions with a great deal of skill and excellence. It is also a relatively small formation, a few thousand men at most, and so fairly easy to organize, lead, and supply. The complete opposite of the 250,000 strong conscript and contract soldier force invading Ukraine in 2022. And it is swiftly becoming obvious that the Russian command staff is simply not capable of effectively organizing and leading such a vast army, at least not in the face of actual resistance, which they seemingly didn't plan for occurring at all. And this is where we return to the drones. Ukraine had some 30-odd TB2 Baykar Bayraktar drones, and have since received another 70 from Turkey. These are, as mentioned, Type 2 armed UAVs of a Turkish make, or, well, the design history of the TB2 is actually quite fascinating, as it includes Turkey pulling a fast one on multiple other nations, but that's not the topic of today, so maybe another time. The salient point is that the TB2 is not a particularly sophisticated drone. It would basically be a slightly inferior version of the US Predator, and those things are made quite expressly to operate in uncontested airspace. The TB2 is not particularly stealthy, it doesn't fly particularly high, and in aerospace terms is about as fast as a dead dog frozen in syrup. In the face of modern Russian AA systems like the Tor or AAA like the Buk, the TB2 should be falling out of the sky like autumn rain. And that's before we get to the Russian Air Force, who should be flying unchallenged in Ukrainian skies right now, shooting the drones out of the skies in their dozens. Yet, it isn't happening. And there really is no excuse for this. Seeing footage of a drone knocking out the very systems to which they should be dead meat is just embarrassing. The only possible explanation is that the Russian forces are operating without continuous anti-air coverage, which, considering they are now stuck in miles-long stationary traffic jams, is beyond stupid. And there seems to be no real reason for this either, beyond criminal neglect and incompetence, that is. Normally, you might not want to operate radar systems like those on the Buk continuously in fear of enemy seed, but Ukraine can't possibly be conducting seed operations right now. In case you're confused, by the way, SEED stands for Suppression of Enemy Air Defenses, and a key component of this is specialized missiles of a very particular make, anti-radiation missiles. When a radar dish is on, it's constantly sending out radar waves, then picking up the return bouncers to determine where things are. The missile is designed to pick up on those radar waves, and then, quite simply, follow them right to the source, and then explode. Simple, but very effective. However, like with most modern-day military weapons, using them is considerably more complicated, and SEED operations requires a sizable commitment of air power, including fighter support. And from what we've seen so far, if the Russians have done anything correct, it is that their initial strike against the Ukrainian Air Force has been pretty effective. They didn't manage to fully destroy it, but they certainly beat the ever-living hell out of it. Probably far beyond, again, the possible situation where they could be operating SEED missions. And, come to think of it, I don't even know if Ukraine has anti-radiation weapons. But even if they did, considering the losses the Russians are apparently suffering along their supply columns right now, they should be hammering away on active radar at every moment of every day, because it probably couldn't get all that much worse. And this blatant disregard for the capabilities of the Ukrainian army also extends to many other theaters of operation, ground combat being a big one. I hesitate to mention again all of the footage we see of burnt out Russian tanks, but there is a reason why we are seeing this. A lot of it is morale and training, as I mentioned last time, but a lot of it is also undoubtedly due to not properly informing the soldiers of the kind of weapon systems they are going to be coming up against. In fact, it's rather interesting that over the last few days, we are starting to see an uptick in Ukrainian vehicles knocked out as well. Things like the BTR-4, for example, has been seen abandoned along roadsides or burnt out. Now, of course, this might simply be because we didn't see this footage until now, because Russia has fought the social media war in a very different way than Ukraine, but it might also be indicative of the fact that the Russian army is beginning to learn the harsh lessons imparted by good old-fashioned experience. It may also be that, as many have theorized, the first wave were made up primarily of conscripts and not particularly enthusiastic Russian troops, whereas the fresh reinforcements are far more seasoned and elite formations that might actually be able to give the Ukrainians a real run for their money, as in many areas the front is currently apparently rather fluid, with some reports even of sizable Ukrainian counterattacks, including one to the north of Kiev that may have cut off the Russian supply columns leading to the city. If that is true, I would be starting to get very nervous as a Russian commander right now. big if, mind you, as I've only really seen a single picture suggesting this, and there are some potential inconsistencies as well, with some reports suggesting that the bridge was destroyed, others saying that it wasn't, and on the picture you can very clearly see the bridge in question. I did try looking up the local weather on, well, literally Google, so take it for what it is, and it seems plausible, but again, very big if. And finally, let's talk a little bit more about the equipment being used here, because that is another area in which the Russians have probably underestimated the Ukrainian army. One big thing to remember is that the Ukrainians and the Russians used to be close allies. They have undoubtedly trained with one another, they utilize much the same equipment, and in many cases they probably use much the same kind of tactics and training as well. The two forces will be fairly familiar with one another in many ways, but unlike Russia, Ukraine has also received a great deal of training and expertise from Western powers, as there has been quite a few military advisors over there teaching them how to use new anti-tank weaponry and systems. We've already briefly touched upon things like the N-law in the previous video, so I won't go over that here. Suffice to say, Ukraine's anti-tank weaponry, the N-laws, the EC laws they're going to be receiving now, and various other anti-tank guided missiles are very, very, very potent weapons. But of course, they shine the most on the defensive, where they can sit in cover at the end of a long road and fire off long-range shots with guided munitions. How about Ukraine's offensive capabilities? As I mentioned in the end of the last video too, what Ukraine should be doing right now is probably trying to cut off or harass Russian supply lines. This means that the Ukrainian army is going to have to take the offensive, and that is not easy. It is always much easier to be the defender than the aggressor, particularly in modern warfare, with all of the advantages of modern-day ATGMs and long-range firing computers. And speaking of firing computers, let's start with the tanks, because as we all know, whilst the infantry are the real stars of any battlefield where territory needs to be seized and held, it's always nice to have a tank on your side. The Russian army will primarily be deploying the relatively modern T-90 or huge quantities of the heavily upgraded T-72. They will be coming up against the Ukrainian T-84 Oplot M. This is their recent improvement upon old T-80 MBTs inherited from the Soviet Union. The upgrade package does appear to be pretty damn good, and would probably put the T-84M at very near, if not perfect, parity with the likes of the T-72 upgraded version, and whilst not quite as close to the T-90, it wouldn't be horribly obsolete or outdated either. In all due reality, tank duels in modern-day Ukraine will almost certainly be decided by the simple question of who sees, fires, and hits the other first. And note the 3 steps there, because it isn't all quite that simple in modern-day tank combat. Both the T-90 and the T-84 Oplot both have some pretty serious electronic countermeasures, in addition to, well, good old-fashioned armor and explosive reactive armor. The electronic countermeasures on both tanks function in much the same ways, but with their own various little quirks and differences. The basic idea is that the electronic countermeasures are capable of noticing when a tank is being targeted by a laser. Most modern-day tanks will use a laser rangefinder to figure out how far away the enemy is, and then lay the gun barrel on target to fire accurate long-range shots. Once the sensors notice the laser, they will then automatically fire out smoke grenades. And these aren't any old smoke grenades either, as they will block a great deal of sensors and lasers from going through them. The intention being, of course, to make sure that even if you get seen first, you aren't necessarily fired at or hit first. Similarly, the T-90 and the T-84 Oplot also have various defenses against anti-tank guided missiles, by, for example, interfering with the guidance system or attempting to jam and or blind them with lasers of their own, making sure that even if they are spotted first and fired at first, they still might not get hit first. Modern anti-tank combat gets awfully complicated awfully quickly. When it comes to infantry carriers, IFVs and APCs, again, the two sides are fairly even. Russia definitely does have an advantage in IFVs, as they have the BMP-3 compared to the BMP-2 of Ukraine. In APCs, however, the Ukrainian BTR-4 is a damn nice little vehicle. It's far too tall, really, being a solid half-meter plus taller than the BMP, but in terms of weaponry, it is very well armed, with two anti-tank guided missiles, a 30mm autocannon, and an automatic 30mm grenade launcher. That is plenty fire support for any infantry assault. In this case, neither side has any real massive advantages. The primary danger, then, to a Ukrainian offensive is going to be first and foremost enemy air superiority, which the Ukrainians are going to be able to do very little about in all due reality, though they do have access to fairly effective MANPADs, man-portable air defense weaponry, and they're also receiving a great deal of Stingers from Germany. That's a pretty big deal because the Stinger is a fairly effective anti-air weapon, particularly against much of the older Russian ground attack aircraft. They're also going to have potentially a hard time with artillery, but this can be mitigated to a considerable extent by their effective usage of drones, as they will be able to find targets more effectively, engage them with artillery, and then have the artillery move before any enemy counter-battery fire comes swooping down from the heavens. All in all, the Ukrainian army absolutely does seem to have the capabilities to launch counterattacks, and they might potentially even be very successful considering the, in many cases, seemingly exposed positions of the Russian army. But only time will tell. What does appears to be clear is that yes, Russia did severely underestimate the Ukrainian army, and a lot of this does not appear to be the error of the soldiers on the ground. It seems to be mistakes made by upper management, by the generals, and, considering the nature of the Russian army, quite possibly the political leadership. Anywho, I'll wrap it up there. Until next time, I have been Arch, as always. I want to point out here at the end too, I am not a military professional. These are merely my educated guesses from the 10,000-foot view of a person passionate for all things military. Until next time, have a good day.